As our listeners know, here on the Business Immigration Benchmark, we are diving into compliance and workforce strategies in 2025, these issues being top of mind. And here with us today is the gold standard in these HR and global mobility issues. I'm so excited for Cassie Ramos to join us here on the Business Immigration Benchmark. Cassie, welcome and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Laura. This is exciting to be here. So, like Laura said, my name is Cassie Ramos. I am currently a lead global mobility partner at Biogen. I've been here for just over 5 years. Interestingly, I started right before the pandemic started, so December 2019. So, it's been an interesting ride to see how the immigration space and the global mobility space has changed since the pandemic and the pendulum swings, and we'll probably get into that a bit more. Before that, I was practicing as an immigration attorney for about 7 years at a couple of different law firms, a big law firm, small law firm, all of those things. So, kind of got that background and then pulled that into what I'm doing now.
Amazing. So you've seen a number of compliance challenges just in your time at Biogen through the pandemic
Yes.
alone. And so I would really love to, pick your brain into what you're doing in your role to really lead workforce strategies and lead effective communication. Because I think, as we talked about in our prep call, like the effective communication really is the building block, the bottom of the pyramid, so to speak, in managing compliance. So, from your perspective, what are the key components to effective communication in an international workforce?
There are so many components to it, right? So, effective communication, I think, starts from my lens, from the immigration perspective, with empathy. Understanding that folks don't go through this all day, every day. They don't fully understand the complications, but at the same time, the streamlined nature in which all of this works. So when you're in the day to day, it feels like, oh, that's not something to worry about. But when it's your life and your family and all of that, folks feel differently. So understanding where others are coming from and trying to meet them there, honestly, right? So that the communication needs to meet folks where they are. So try not to use as much legalese, right? Keeping language simple is really important. So empathy is a huge one. And then there's a cultural component of it all, right? Some people do better with
Sure.
written communications. Some people do better with a lot of words, and some people need kind of the visuals, right? So really, again, meeting people where they are there and making sure that the frequency with which you're doing it is helpful to the individuals to whom you're sharing it. So if you're sharing information about travel, people are going to travel at different points, but we're mindful of the summertime is going to be a big travel time. Holidays are a big travel time. So we try to push out communications, what we call our offline special communications then, in addition to the monthly regular cadence of communications that we're sending out, so that folks have something to work off of. And hopefully it's the most up to date thing. I think in this day and age, information comes at folks so quickly that it's hard to parse through what is current, what is no longer considered to be important anymore, and what's coming down the pike. So, thinking about all of those three different things, we are trying to make sure that everybody has the information they need at the time that they need it.
Yeah, how are you balancing the distribution, the effective distribution of, like, the real-time updates and being proactive and tailoring the
Yeah.
communication? Do you have any guidance there? Because that's
Yeah,
tough.
it is, especially when you don't have a whole team behind you doing it, right? So I talk a lot about the communications that we're doing and putting it out there. My husband's in marketing. So he's like, "Oh, why don't you have somebody in marketing help you with this?" And I was like, "Because this is my thing, right? This
Yeah.
is immigration is so specific, global mobility is so specific that sometimes the communications you put out are no longer applicable like the next day or 2 days later." So we're trying to insert into our communications as much go to this website for up to date information.
Yeah.
So truly, in our communications as a small team, we are really focused on making sure that folks have the right resources to the up to date information. We're not always going to have it ourselves. I read quite a bit on immigration, I get emails from basically, I think most, if not every immigration law firm that you can think of. I get all the emails from them, right? WR included, and it's all really good information. It also needs to be shared out with the right people,
Right.
right? So making sure that folks are reading information from reputable places. And that's really kind of our big goal when it comes to our communications, because we just can't be with everybody everywhere at the same time.
Well, and even to your point, like, even synthesizing the really great newsletters that you're receiving
Yeah.
and subscribing to, like, that takes a ton of time, and by the time you synthesize it, especially what we're seeing in, Q1 of
Yep.
2025, is that by the time you push that out, it could be out of date. So
Yeah.
so I like your idea of part of your messaging being, "Here's the messaging we have today, and here's the reputable sources to review before you travel,"
Yeah.
because I think you could be advising someone today and that it changes tomorrow. And I had a story that we shared in our prep call where, we're generally advising caution against travel. And we had an individual client who was set to travel. I've got my visa appointment. I'm going to go. Only now to be caught up in their appointment being dropped, they no longer qualify for the visa waiver. And so at the time, we were advising that the space is dynamic and it was okay today. But by the time this person showed up for their appointment, they didn't accept their
Yep.
Dropbox. So there was really no way to prevent it because this person was gonna travel,
That's it.
and, even if they looked at the information literally the day before their appointment,
Right.
he was eligible.
That's exactly it. We sent out our newsletter, our monthly newsletter. We sent it out last Friday, and I just happened to be looking up something, or maybe I even got an alert like that morning about that exact topic. And I was like, oh, people need to know this now, right? Because again, you're planning, you're making all these plans, thinking that you're fully understanding the risks of these plans.
Yeah.
And then, right, the government is like, but not really. Like
Yeah, not today.
you'll figure it out on the other side. And it's like, well, the other side is literally the other side of the world. So I do need some more straightforward guidance on what the next steps look like. And right, we don't know what's gonna come up.
Right.
There are like that was one that I think caught a good amount of people off guard, to be
For
frank.
sure.
So I think that again, having folks get access to the right resources where they are getting these alerts themselves when they're preparing to travel, when they're looking at these things, you're probably not going to look back. Again, you've created your appointment; it's all set. You're not going to look back and say, "Oh, okay, well now I need to consider this." Probably not. So
Probably
getting
not,
those
no.
alerts is so important and so incredibly critical for our foreign nationals, but then, like you said, distilling all of that information into one specific space.
And how are you communicating in these, like, monthly alerts? How are you communicating, a sense of urgency in the sense that we're recording today, February 20th, and things are changing rapidly, and how are you delivering the message of urgency and without causing alarm, right? Like, we don't wanna be
I
scaring
know.
people
Yep.
and, do you have any practical tips of the tone you're giving? I mean, I know this is kind of an impossible answer I'm asking you to give me, but any sort of guideposts you lean on when delivering this messaging to your program?
It is. It's a fine line that you're toggling between scaring people and saying, do not travel, which I think some programs want to do, right? They really want to discourage folks from traveling. And I'm like, listen, I want you to live your life. I want you to be aware of the risks that are existing right now if you're living your life in that way, right? So my approach is trying to have a professional, friendly, right, still tone, but also be aware of this possibility because I don't want it to come back and bite anybody, myself, but really mostly the individual, right? I really empathize because I think of myself as a parent traveling with my children. Like, that's the shoes that I put myself in most. And I'm like, okay, so if I'm a parent traveling with my children and I have a visa appointment at a consulate for myself and my family, do I want to show up and have anything go wrong? Absolutely not. Granted, I'm a planner, like a
Yeah.
very again, my husband will tell you, like, kind of a crazy planner sometimes where, I'll be the one that's, like, booking our Uber 3 months in advance to get to the airport because I want to know that I have the Uber 3 months in advance to get to the airport.
It's you check that box, yeah,
Yeah, but I
exactly.
won't get to the airport early, I'll tell you that much. Like, I only get to the airport, like, no more than an hour and a half before my flight. I do not like sitting at airports. But if I was traveling with my children, it probably would look different. But right, so like that's kind of that's the persona that I think about as I'm putting out these communications, and I'm saying, what would I want to know for sure? And then if I was in somebody else's shoes and I was traveling to my home country, right? So a place that I'm familiar with, but then going through a process in that space that I'm not familiar with, what does that look like? Honestly, even for like the most seasoned of folks, I feel like it looks different every time, right? Like, I mean, again, this visa processing is really the prime example where if you got a visa last year, 2 years ago, you were fine. The job box was fine. And this time it's different. If you got a visa 5 years ago, it looked different. So it's really more about, I know you've gone through this process before, but you need to stay up to date because it's going to look different every time.
Yeah, I think that's right, and that do you talk about it in, like, risk tolerances? Because that's lately how I've been framing
Yeah.
things with folks that, like, "Here's the guidance I'm gonna give you," like, with the empathy of, like, I wouldn't wanna do this with my kids,
Yeah.
but one could take on the risk tolerance, and then here's what it's gonna look like if the worst case happens so that
Correct.
they're sort of aware, but those are not easy conversations, and I think that's key. They're usually conversations, like, I don't know
Yes.
how you get that into an FAQ. Right?
Yes, that's exactly it. That is exactly it. It's certainly the spectrum of risk tolerance is very wide, right? So again, it depends on the family, it depends on a whole lot of factors that there's no way we can ever predict what those factors will look like.
Right.
But what we can say is, here's what the expectations are as of today, and I make that very clear that these are expectations as of today, because again, tomorrow things might change very quickly, and we just don't have insight into that. So go to this place for that information. If you want more information, absolutely reach out to the right people. And my hope is that folks are reaching out to, if not our team, then at least to our legal counsel, because that really is the best place for them to go. And then it's about creating that space for them to talk to folks, right? So providing again the resourcing, but we also have monthly office hours where folks have the opportunity to chat with legal counsel about things like this: travel, visa stamping, what happens if, all of these things. We can have, like you said, we can have as many FAQs as we want, but each situation might look different, right? You might have somebody who is on an H-1B themselves and they have H-4 spouse and children.
Are you seeing high engagement or higher engagement these months in 2025 in those office hours because of the changes in the visa stamping rules and travel?
Yeah, I would say we've been tracking probably since about mid-year last year. We've been doing this for a really long time, but we've
Okay.
really been formally tracking it since about mid last year. Probably had, you know, in a full day slot, it's 15-minute increments, probably have about like 30 slots available.
Okay.
I'd say maybe a third of them would have been filled as of November. Last month, almost all of them were filled. This month,
Okay.
we have a wait list.
Okay. Oh, that's amazing. Okay, I mean, not that there's people waiting, but that,
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
people
But the
are,
wait
like,
list is
engaging.
correct. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And a
Yeah.
lot of them are the same question. What
Yeah.
happens if I get an administrative processing, right? What
Yeah.
happens if all of those things? And, they're not all legal questions either, right? So, like, that's
Right.
the marriage of, right? There's the legal questions of, here's what might happen if you go to the visa appointment and it looks different. But then there's on the other side is the company's policy,
Right.
right?
Yes. Yeah.
Then what happens if, right? So that's also part of the information that we're sharing is, FYI, here's the risk, and here's why it's a big risk is potentially you might be stuck out of the US for who knows how long, right? We're right now saying 60 days because that's what it was previously, but it might look different.
Sure.
And if you're out of the country for 60 days, here's what happens, right? So it's not only the risk tolerance, but it's also like preparing yourself, preparing your managers. We're all here to do a job still. You still have a job to do. Your visa processing might be a part of that, but you still have a job to do here.
I think you brought up 2 excellent points I wanna touch on. One is that in those office hours, 90% of those office hour calls for the individual are gonna look the same, and that you're like, "Well, we should just boil this down to an FAQ," but it's really like that, last 10% or those last 5 minutes of the call where there'll be, like, extremely strange or unique situations that come up that you're like, "No, they still need the call because they've got something going on that I could never predict or put into an FAQ," right?
Yeah. I call it like lobbing a grenade over the fence without
Yeah.
knowing that it's a grenade. right?
Like,
You're like, "Oh,
"What
I'm
about
just lobbing a
this?"
tennis ball." And it's like, "No, no, no, there's a grenade in there because I just blew up everything I just said.
Yeah.
So ignore what I just said. And in fact, now this is a serious situation," right? It's like, "Oh, okay. All that sounds good. By the way, I don't know where my child's birth certificate is." And it's like,
Well, that's gonna be problematic. Yeah,
"That's gonna be
exactly.
a problem. Like, are you?" And it's just like, "Is that a right? Like, we have that passport." And it's like,
Right.
maybe, but, like, let's walk through, right? So you're absolutely right that it's really the different forms of communication. Um, I think it's a challenge to do it all again as a small team. I'm a team of 1 here in
Okay.
terms of the immigration side. So I
Sure.
sit on the global mobility team, and I have other colleagues that do global mobility, but from an immigration perspective, it's me who everything, right, comes through. And so when you
Sure.
have a team of 1, it's really hard to stay on top of all of those things. So what are the different avenues, like you said, that we're giving folks to have either a conversation or send an email or just really have them give them the written communication of the newsletter and then the follow-up after that.
Totally, and I think, as a team of 1 or just even to be effective, and I talk about it all the time is, like, reporting. You'll bucket, the individuals into category A, B, and we're gonna, sort of target the communications that way, to be effective, but that inevitably you have to leave some space for the tailored conversations, the hand-holding, because there's just people might fit into this bucket A, needing this type of guidance. I have a visa
Right.
and it's valid for the next 2 years, but I have all these other issues that need space to be discussed,
Right.
and that's tough. The other thing you talked about was, communicating company policy. So it's always right now we're focusing on what's the communication. Are we being effective to the foreign national managing their compliance component? Can you tell me a little bit about how you manage the conversation with like stakeholders? So when you're discussing the remote work policy, if y'all have one, or discussing, hey, the travel guidance for foreign nationals is getting tighter, or folks might get stuck outside the U.S. like we saw in the pandemic. Um, how are you managing those communications to managers or leadership within the company?
Yeah, I think the structure of the company depends highly on how folks are doing it. I had the opportunity to be a part of a corporate roundtable recently, so got a good amount of ideas from
Cool.
different folks on how they're doing it. We don't really communicate with managers directly as often.
Okay,
We do it through our HR teams.
got it.
We'll send kind of something to the foreign nationals, and when we say send, like, it truly is over email, right now. So, again, the different modes of communication, but it is through email, and then we'll forward it on to the HR business partners and say, "Cascade this to your teams," and hopefully the teams are cascading it to their client groups. For a couple of reasons. One is that managers are constantly changing, and so the idea of going
Sure.
through and looking for everybody's manager is a bit daunting, again, as a small team. But then 2, it's that we don't want managers to be alerted necessarily to the fact that they have a foreign national on their team if they have never been alerted to it, right? So there's a bit of a right, we're all in the same company, but there is kind of a small bit of a privacy concern that if the foreign national hasn't shared with their manager, like, how much do they want their managers knowing? So kind of keeping that separation and keeping it broader is really where we're aiming for. I met another company that's much smaller than ours, and their program is smaller than ours, and she was like, "I talk to every single manager. I have a full-on conversation." I was like, "That's awesome. Good for you. I will never do that." Managers find me. I can't walk around my office without having a manager be like, "Oh, just one more question about blah, blah, blah about my, employee," but that's really the way that it has to go, right? So I think it definitely runs the spectrum of constant communications with managers versus, communicating through other client groups and stuff. And then I think it also the other piece is where are you sharing this information? So like I said, we're right now sharing it through email. We're fingers crossed hoping to create a page on our intranet where all of this will live. Not only for our national employees, but what we're realizing truly over the last, I guess, 3 weeks to a month is that a lot of our US employees, so in the immigration context, when we say US employees, you mean citizens and green card holders, have a lot of questions too. So we talk a lot about, supporting our foreign nationals, but it's like, well, what about the rest of the population that may not need sponsorship but still has questions? Where are they getting their information from? And there was a bit of that black hole, I guess, that we realize like we're not reaching, and we really should be reaching out to those folks. And again, right, bringing it back, making sure that they have the right resources and they have the right information.
Yeah, that makes complete sense to me. Shifting gears a little bit, this is sort of what we touched on, but the cultural intelligence and global mobility. So
Yeah.
we're speaking about like, effective communication, but then also kind of acknowledging, are we incorporating this in how we're supporting all of the program, recognizing that career goals could be different, who's supporting the career goals. Can you tell us a little bit about how you're navigating and incorporating cultural intelligence into your program?
It's really an interesting dynamic, is the best way I can put it, because you're right. Some folks are, "Hey, I've started this company. Next day, am I getting a green card here? Am I getting the I-140 here?" Some folks let it go for so long, and sometimes it's hard when you're human and it's like, okay, well, I can empathize with both sides. But at the same time, there are drawbacks to both sides. And I think tried to be very thoughtful about how we are establishing those policies and for whom, right? So it really is the 80-20 rule. We're establishing these policies for the 80% of folks that are going to fall into this category, this area, this bucket. And then the other 20% we'll deal with on a case by case basis and hope to manage that in as consistent a way as possible as the 80%. But that certainly is a consideration. And so I think when it comes to the cultural intelligence, it's about what the policies are and how we're communicating them. Who are they for? Are they for the rank and file? Are they for executives? Are they for HR versus finance versus IT, right? So thinking about how those different groups operate is the starting point for our policies and considering all of those different areas. When you're looking at the cultural differences, right, they're not wide enough that you can't communicate in the same way. But again, that's why we have the different modes of communication, right? Some cultures really appreciate the direct, here's what it is, here's what the risks are, and that's all that there is. Some cultures, it's a little more touchy-feely, right? Of like, "Well, you could do this and you could do that. I would recommend this." It looks different for each one, and so it, again, is meeting folks where they are. So, pushing information out to the 80% and then having that other 20% come to you and say, "I really need a call about this. Can you
Yeah.
create, a deck or something else so that, I can share this with my team?" That's really kind of, it's that 20% that we're here to make sure that they fully understand it if it's the standard that we've created is not for them.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think it's like you have to build that 20% capacity
Yeah.
to handle the individual because, yeah, I've got a client story where they initiate green cards after 2 years, for everyone, and so this one gentleman, he's on a TN, he's Canadian, and he's like, "Why am I on this call? Like, I don't want a green card." And it was
Yeah.
like, "Oh, okay, like, let's
Yeah.
take this offline," and, the company's like, "Well, why don't you want one?" Like, the
Yeah.
assumption was you want one, and he's like, "Well, I don't wanna retire here, in the US. I wanna retire back in Canada." And
Interesting. Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
you have this and you're like, "Okay, well, great. We'll just maintain the TN until you're ready to retire, and then we'll
Yeah.
go from there." And the company, like, had just not
Yeah.
considered this possibility.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, sometimes the conversation that I'm having is that I'm like, who hurt? Right? So like where folks are like, "Oh, no, 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 I don't need a green card," or I don't need an H-1B, like, that's fine. And I'm like, "No, we're offering this to you. Like, this isn't a trap. Like, why wouldn't you take it?" And they're just like, I don't know, at my last company, and you're like, "Okay, say no more. I don't really care to hear anymore of like what happened and, I started and then blah, 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 and all." And so it really is like, you don't know what the baggage of people are bringing in, right? And so we're offering something that we're like, "Oh my gosh, what a great thing that we're doing." And folks are just like, "No, I'm good." And it's like, "Oh,
Yeah, and
that's,
then you're kinda confused.
yeah. Yeah."
Yeah.
And then they're confused because they're like, "Why would I?" And so, right, again, it all comes back to the communication of like deep dive, explaining more about, here's the benefit to you.
Right.
And I'm actually very transparent where I'm like, and here's the benefit to our company, right? Like it's
Okay.
not
You include that.
just,
That's amazing.
absolutely, like it's not just about, hey, we're here, this is an employer. We're all here to do a job. We're all here to work. We're all here to make ourselves better, and make the rest of the world better in theory, right? And so I say like, "Oh, well, this is great for you, but also like we're not having to go through this process with you multiple times." So, you
Right.
know, it's a win-win.
Yeah.
Choose to take it or not, but it's a win-win for everybody.
Well, and then that's a good communication to then share with managers or leadership if they have questions. Because often when, for another client, we're asking for authorization to proceed with things and they just have no idea, like, well, why do we need it? Right. And it's just sort of lost. More context is needed. So it's nice that you're building that into the communication going out to the foreign national, as well as, could flip it easily to leadership. That's
Absolutely.
effective communication.
And making sure that leadership and right, so to your point about the other stakeholders, like we include if it's bad-ish news, and bad news for us, knock on wood, so far is, what happens if somebody's not selected in the cap? That's really
Sure.
the standard, like, bad news email that we're sending out right now. Um, we're including managers and HR business partners on there
Okay.
for sure, because that's like, again, planning.
Yes.
You might lose
Absolutely.
this individual at this time. What is the team gonna do if that happens? Like, we would
Right.
never want that to happen, in the next month. And then it's like, well, what do I do now? When's the person coming back? All of those things. So we really look at everything with an eye towards what happens if.
That's amazing because I think everybody appreciates when it's bad news, being early, as early as it's, realized, and as clear and as transparent as you can for the planning because you can't control if you're selected in the H-1B lottery, but you certainly can control when you're having that conversation and planning for it. I wanna transition into the evolving landscape of global mobility, and we sort of talked about, the trends during the pandemic and your role has really evolved since you've joined Biogen in December of 2019. Can you tell us a little bit about where you've been and where you see asking you to pull
Yeah.
out your crystal ball,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
where global mobility will be in the near future, near long
Yeah.
term, however long you wanna predict for?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like I said, right, even I could go through my career, right, and say at this time it looked like this, and at this time it looked like this, and So in December 2019, everybody was in the office, right? Everybody, the majority of folks, right, 80% of folks were in the office 5 days a week, no problems. People were moving. If you were moving, you were expected to be in the office. Pandemic hits, everybody's remote. Okay, we all roll through that and we get through that. And then after that, this is the time that we're in, right? Is that kind of that post-pandemic, what is this looking like? And the pendulum seems to be swinging back the other way towards everybody being in the office 5 days a week, or I'd say the majority of folks being in the office at least 3 days a week, if not 5. So people want to be physically close to their offices. Leaders want their employees to be physically close to them. Great. The question then becomes in the global mobility space, well, are we going to move the talent or are we going to hire local? And I found it depends on the country, depends on the market, like so many different factors it depends on. But it's a strategy decision that I'm not sure if a lot of organizations have really kind of fleshed the entire thing out, I guess is the best way to put it, right? Even the ones that are saying, well, everybody has to come in 5 days a week. It's like, so is that everybody? Like, how are you tracking that? Kind of all of those things. And so that's kind of where I see global mobility going now is either your organization has decided we're going to try to hire local because we can, right? Our roles are mostly junior, our roles are um, if not unskilled, but doesn't require a whole lot of judgment and that level of hiring versus we need to find the talent wherever they are and we'll move them.
Yeah.
And when you are going to move them, then what does it look like, right? What incentives are you offering? So I do see us swinging back towards certainly not an employees market, but back towards the folks need to move but they need to be incentivized to move depending on the area, of course, too, right? Uh, I know that, like, there are companies out there that really, really immediately after the pandemic, I would say, or immediately after offices were opened back up, they were trying to figure out how to get folks to I'll put it as areas of the United States that if you're not from the United States, you're not super eager to go to and potentially may not have heard of it. I'm not gonna call it any states in particular because I think every state is, has their qualities and all of that fun stuff. But, you have to really be creative and strategic with what are you offering to those folks to get them to come to that place and come into the office.
Yeah, no kidding. I think, do you think we're gonna see this is my question to you, do you think you're gonna start seeing more intention within departments about their recruitment or retention strategies and, relocation, whether that includes, an immigration component or not? Or do you see it kind of being like case by case? Because right now it feels very case by case, very loosey goosey. Do you think the trend in the coming years will be like more intentional, like more clear guideposts for divisions or departments?
I think so. I do. I think that what we're seeing right now is a wait and see approach, and we're US centric, right? So a wait and
Yeah.
see approach to how this administration rolls out this first year. What
Yeah.
delays are we seeing? Where are we seeing the delays? How has that impacted our business? And then after probably about mid-year or so of this year, I can see folks saying, okay, here's where we see the biggest delays are, right? Our IT folks are having a really hard time with getting H-1Bs because every single one is questioned, and we're spending so much money on this because it's the H-1B, it's an RFE, if they need to leave and get the visa, all of those things. Our scientists, right? So we're a biopharmaceutical company. Our scientists rarely have any issues. My guess is because half of it goes over USCIS's head because it goes over my head for sure. Where I'm like, okay, that sounds super important. We're just going to put that down there. And I don't know if anybody fully is understanding, right, what we're writing down, but somebody understands it. The person who's doing it understands it. And that's
For
really what
sure.
matters most from my lens. But I think that it's going to depend on the industry for sure. I can see again, I what I keep going back to with this administration for sure when it comes to delays and increased fees and all of that is I do feel like we're back at the beginning of the pandemic, right? Where you're trying to figure out who are the priority individuals that we need to make sure get into the country, get extensions, get travel authorization. Holy moly, I absolutely remember during the pandemic that like we had one high level executive who didn't get an advance parole document for himself and his family for I think it was pending for like 10 months. Like what at the time was like a crazy amount of time. And I was like, of course, this is the one that it's gonna come down to, right? So it's learning from those kinds of things. And again, I really am not trying to keep coming back to the communication piece, but it really is, right? It is about communicating and saying at the very beginning, like, here's a possibility. We have a crazy outlier that we saw at one point where it was up to 10 months of waiting time. Are you willing to wait that long for this? And if not, then we need to pivot and be more creative. It's, making sure that the necessary stakeholders have the right information to make the decisions and then keeping them up to date on those decisions. I think my sense is that if it starts taking too long, I think managers are going to get gun shy and they're going to be like, nope, the last one took way too long. I don't have the capacity to wait that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think my sense is that it's gonna take a little longer for it to sort of get fleshed out. I think 2026 we'll see more definition based on business unit, based on departments, their sponsorship tolerance, because I think it's gonna push on budgets this year. I think with delays, I think with pushback from the government, those departments might not have budgeted for it, and
Yeah.
then they're gonna be reviewing at the year end and just say like, "Wow, we, like, blew through our budget for, this talent maintenance," and then they're gonna make a decision of, is it worth it or not? And then we're gonna see that play out in 2026 where they're gonna start having some more policies. Because right now I'm seeing a lot of just exceptions. "Yeah, I want premium processing," and then people are like, "Sure, sure, sure." I think people are gonna review their budget in the end of the year and just say like, "Wow, like, this is costing too much," or, "Wow, we were able to retain all these people, this was great." And then make decisions about, like you said, local market hire, relocation hire, those types of things.
I 100% agree, and the budget absolutely drives the policy.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound great when you say it like, "Oh, the money, like, follow the money," but it really is, right? Last year, 2 years ago, I can't remember when, um, the Biden administration wanted to increase or did increase the filing fees. Created a whole deck on, here's what the filing fees are gonna look like. This is what we're supporting now. Do we wanna continue supporting these things? That's the conversation that we're having, right? Here's what the budget's gonna look like. Do we wanna continue doing this or not? And if the answer is not, then how do we communicate that, right, to the right people? So if we premium process somebody previously, and you're not gonna premium process in the future, how are we communicating that to the right people, and when do we communicate that to the right people? Premium processing I-140s, like, that's probably one of the bigger variances I've seen is, most, I'd say, organizations I have yet to meet an organization that does a premium process changing employers. because it's
Right. No,
like, well,
everybody
I
does.
right, I need the person to start, and that's like the critical time. But to your exact point, maintenance of the talent is I think where we get a bit lax, to be frank. I think
Okay.
organizations are like, oh, if they're already here, like, why would we deepen your processing for them? And from my lens, I absolutely get it where it's like, so someone's $3,000. So if you're high volume, like that matters a lot. If you're not high volume or you have managers that only have one or two foreign nationals, it's hard for them to see from a programmatic perspective how much that cost increases.
Right. I agree.
So when you're talking about the business unit, right, the teams, right, how are we separating all those things? The size of the organization, I think, is what's going to drive that strategy.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna have you back on next year so we can check in on our prediction.
That's exactly it.
When you're recorded, you get the pleasure of revisiting things you've said.
It is great, right? In 2026, it's gonna be like, so nobody went back into the office like you thought they were going to. Everybody revolted, right? All of
Yeah.
these things that you never thought was gonna happen happened. Unlikely, right? But
Oh, totally.
yeah,
No, totally. We chatted a little bit about, succession planning. Again, so this kind of talks about, like, future of work or what we're seeing in the space. Can you tell us a little bit about, like, your perm planning and leadership engagement? Because I think those go hand in hand with how we're thinking about maintaining talent and, using a green card strategy and involving leadership in that discussion. Tell us how you're engaging those conversations.
I think when it comes to maintaining talent, it's maintaining it from the very beginning of that relationship, and that relationship does start when that individual is a kid. So it's making sure that we are reviewing our candidates and certainly confirming whether they can get immigration support. But then down the line, what happens, right? So we have a case now where the individual is coming into a role with the master's, but the role doesn't require a bachelor's degree. So I got off a call yesterday with the hiring manager and I said, well, this is what this is going to mean long term for this individual. This means that in 3 years, when their F1 EAD expires, they got to find something else, whether it's through this organization or something else. Ideally, it's through this organization, but
Sure.
it might not be. And so I'd say that our culture is very supportive of folks moving around. Not all cultures, organization cultures are like that, right? So
No.
the hiring manager was like, "Oh, absolutely." He was like, "I think I already know kind of where he's meant to be because this is such a talent." But I've been on way more calls with hiring managers on the perm side, right? So to your point of, well, how are we managing the job description for the perm? Right? It's we're asking folks to look forward into the future based on the information they have now. So, take out your crystal ball, individual manager, and figure out where this person's going to be. Who knows where that manager is, right? They might be on their way out. They might be, right? All of these different kind of factors that we have to think about. And so it really does start at the very beginning of that employment relationship. And it can't wait until the individual is already in the role and is asking for the green right? Or asking for the company to sponsor them. So we're thinking and evolving that way. And then once it comes to that point of the green card, having those conversations again of where do you see this individual in this amount of time, right? So we had this conversation a year ago when the person started, or however long ago before the person started. Now we're at the point where we need you to look again and say, where does this person fit into this organization in the future? So hopefully managers are giving that thought before they even hire first individuals.
No, I like that. I like that you're prompting the conversation about sort of the future role within the perm, because obviously that's a good green card strategy.
Yeah.
And it's almost a little bit like a performance discussion that you're having, like within the sort of immigration strategy. So that can be a little tricky. But I think it would make that sponsored foreign national like feel good and envision, their role with the company in the future and be, satisfied, or at least be having that conversation up front about what that would look like in the years to come. So that's awesome. One of the roundtables we hosted, one company had this really excellent proactive idea about, talking about a candidate. They projected that candidate's sort of, benefits cost, the life cycle from the get-go. So the manager really had, and I think this takes a lot of work and partnership with immigration vendor, is to sort of forecast what that immigration life cycle could look like, and then sort of present the life cycle fees for the benefits to support this candidate. So, like, on the get-go, that manager is signing off on yep, we're going to support all these things. That's what it takes to hire on this talent. I thought that was great because then nothing comes as a surprise and it's all authorized
Yep.
and the expectations for the business unit, the budget is all been managed.
Absolutely. And it helps for the foreign national also, right? Again,
Right.
I'm looking for
Yes.
win-win situations, right? Where it helps the business and it helps the foreign national. If we can hire you in this role now, and then in 3 years or 2 years or however long down the line, right? That's the only time that we can submit an H-1B lottery on your behalf. There's little risk to us, right? Because, not ideal that we lose somebody, especially a great talent. Absolutely not ideal, but we'll figure it out. We'll find somebody. The foreign national themselves, though, like, would you want to go work for a company where you might get an H-1B in a couple of years, but knowing that it's a lottery, you're not really sure? That's a very personal decision, and I would never be able to tell anybody which way to go, right? I would say, I mean, obviously come work here because this is a great organization and, it'll benefit you to a certain extent, but your immigration is yours. So it's not for me to tell you how to operate, but to give you the information so that you can make the best decision for yourself. And then on the other side, I agree with you that, for hiring managers, to know what the cost will look like overall. And then what we found is for hiring managers to know what their involvement looks like. Because listen, there's benefits and many people are willing to throw money at problems, myself included. Right? Like I'm like, listen, throw money at it. Like just take my money. Like I don't care anymore. Like I
Yes.
just deal with it. Right. And there's certain things that you are willing to do that with. And there are others where you're like, okay, well, I have to put in the time for this. For managers, it's a both situation, right?
Sure.
And you need to put in. So we created a chart for our hiring teams to share with managers.
Okay.
The moment that they have an individual who has indicated that they will need Biogen support, we have the hiring team ideally send this chart to managers to say, this is what it would look like if you hired this individual, right? So for the change of employer, we would need 30 minutes of your time. For the perm green card, we might need an hour to an hour and a half to 2 hours of your time. Be prepared for that. It's going to include calls. It's going to include
Yeah.
right job description. So trying to be as descriptive as possible while also leaving room for, right, the different possibilities. And we tried to break it down to the common ones that we've seen, but I hope that managers can appreciate that piece of it to say, okay, looking forward, okay, I have to budget this amount of time. I really like this candidate. This candidate is worth my time. That's what it ends up looking.
That's amazing. I have not heard of like a time budget
Yeah.
estimation for the process. I love
Yeah.
that. I'm
It,
going to
it
steal
came
that.
out of, I had one hiring manager who had two people going for a perm at the same time. And he was like, wait a minute, hold on.
How
I
much
do
we're doing
this
here?
for, yeah, right? Like I do this separately for each person. And I was like, yes. And they're like, "Can I just combine the roles?" And I was like, "No.
No.
If they're not both doing the roles, then it doesn't make it" right? And so
Yeah.
that really prompted us. I mean, right, invention, what is it? Necessity is the source of invention or
Yeah.
whatever that phrasing is.
Sounds about right. Yeah.
I know. Well, we're gonna roll with that.
Yeah.
But that was right, that's what it was, that I was like, "Okay, we need to give managers a heads up of, we're gonna need this amount of time for you," and the noise has gone down considerably. It wasn't a crazy amount of noise either. Again,
Yeah.
our strategy really is hire the best. What we
Right.
need, we'll figure it out, and everybody does figure it out. But I do think that it's helped managers to have a frame of mind as they're going into these conversations of how much do I really like this person is what it comes down to.
Yeah, and I think, hiring any individual is gonna require managers' involvement in different capacities, right? There's always something that a manager is managing, whether it's like an FMLA, leave of absence, that there's always something that's gonna require the manager to be dealing with the human side of the human they're
Correct.
managing.
Right. Right.
And, immigration is just one component of that, whereas, other folks have different issues to be supported as well. So it's just being upfront with like, this is a known issue and here's what we know and how to bucket it. I
Mhm.
love the time management though, because that is so cool. I have not seen companies do that. So kudos. That's super
I mean,
cool.
I'm sure you've gone on calls with managers where they maybe not fuss because I don't know if anybody outwardly is like, I don't want to do this, but
Right.
I have gone on calls with managers where they've been like, this is taking a lot more of my time than I thought it was going to.
Right.
And I'm like, yeah, that's why I have a job. That's
Yeah.
this is not super easy. This is not super straightforward. So, I appreciate that managers are willing to put in that time, but at least like giving them the heads up. I think it's just a courtesy that, I can't believe we hadn't thought about that before.
Yeah, that's amazing. Well, Cassie, we chatted a lot navigating workforce strategies, culture, and even some predictions.
Yeah.
Any concluding thoughts?
I have said this to many people now that this is going to be a marathon. This is going to be a marathon. Get your running shoes on. Get some good running shoes. Get your running shoes on though, and be prepared, right? So it's gonna feel like an onslaught regularly of different things, right? In the previous Trump administration, we called it Freaky Fridays, where every Friday at like
Yeah,
2, right, something would come down, especially during the summer when we had summer hours, and everybody
right.
goes off about like noon 1 and 2 o'clock, we have something coming through and get all of these emails. And I'm like, "Oh, well, that's fun. We'll deal with that on Monday." Right.
Yeah,
So, it's just buckle up, be ready for it. Communicate, communicate, communicate. I cannot express enough how much if folks feel like it's too much, they'll just delete it. And it's better for them to just delete an email than for you not to have sent it.
totally. Well, I think you've given us some really effective techniques and practical guidance to help our listeners here think about adopting some of your practices into their programs. So thanks for your time and expertise, Cassie. We'll catch you next time.
Absolutely. Thank you.